A drawing room in London glows orange in the last hour before midnight in the autumn of 1870, and everything in it has been arranged to look effortless. The fire is built up high in the grate, coal stacked and glowing in a neat pyramid that a housemaid replenished twice already this evening, without anyone in the room noticing her come or go. Gas mantles hiss softly along the walls, throwing a warm, steady light across velvet upholstery, the color of claret, across a mahogany side table, polished to a shine that holds the fire's reflection like a second, smaller flame. A gentleman in a dark coat stands with one elbow on the mantel, describing to his companions in the unhurried cadence of a man who has never once had to think about where his comfort comes from, the marvel of the new railway line that will soon connect his country estate to the capital in under 3 hours. Somewhere below the house, in a cellar reached by a back stair the family never uses, several hundredweight of coal sit in neat black heaps, delivered that week by a merchant's cart, ready to feed this fire and a dozen others like it for a month. Everyone in the room is warm. Everyone in the room is lit. The train that will carry the gentleman home tomorrow runs on the same fuel that is burning in front of him now. And so does the factory that wove the velvet on his chair, and so does the furnace that smelted the iron in the railway line itself. Britain in 1870, workshop of the world, and the thing that makes the workshop run, the thing every gaslit parlour and every steam-driven mill and every warm hearth in the country depends on absolutely and without exception, is coal. Nobody in this room has ever seen where it comes from. Nobody in this room particularly wants to. Beneath the polished floor of that parlour, under the city itself and the fields and moors of half a dozen English counties, a very different world is running at the same hour in the same darkness that has already settled over London's rooftops. It runs 24 hours a day, every day of the year, because coal does not stop needing to be cut, simply because the sun has gone down. 1,000 feet under the ground, in tunnels barely wide enough for a bent man to pass through, other people are working by the light of a flame so weak it barely reaches past their own hands, in heat that would make the gentleman in his dark coat light-headed within minutes. Breathing air thick enough with black dust that a single evening in it stains the inside of the throat. They will not see daylight again for another 8 or 10 hours. Some of them, children among them, have not seen daylight at all since before dawn, and will not see it again until well after dark has fallen a second time. The coal that keeps that London parlour warm and lit and comfortable passed through their hands, their lungs, and in a great many cases their broken bodies on its way up into the light. This is the story the parlour never has to think about, and it is far more complicated, far more uncomfortable, and far more human than any drawing-room conversation of 1870 will ever let on. Britain in 1870 sits at the height of an industrial age. It has largely built for itself a nation of steam engines and iron rail and factory chimneys, stretching from the Midlands to the Scottish lowlands. Coal drives the steam engines that spin the cotton mills of Lancashire. Coal fires the furnaces that turn iron ore into the rails, the ships, the bridges, and the guns of an empire that now spans a quarter of the Earth's surface. Coal heats the terraced houses of the industrial towns and the townhouses of the wealthy alike, and coal, shipped out through ports like Cardiff and Newcastle, has become one of the country's great exports, sold to nations across the globe that have not yet built furnaces of their own. By the year this story is set, Britain is pulling well over 100 million tons of coal out of the ground annually, more than the rest of the world combined, and that number is still climbing. Every single ton of it was cut, loaded, and hauled by hand, by people whose working lives the nation, depending on their labor, almost never paused to consider. This video is that consideration. Not the version that stays in the drawing room, admiring the fire, without asking where it came from. The real one, built from the parliamentary testimony that forced the question into public view in the first place, from the reports of the mine inspectors, whose job it was to count the dead, from the diaries, the wage books, and the decades of careful archival and academic work that historians of the British coalfields, among them Angela V. John and John Benson, have spent tracing so that this labor would not simply be allowed to disappear into a vague, comfortable idea of industrial progress. We are going to descend an actual mineshaft of 1870, thread through the tunnels at the coalface, sit for hours in the dark beside a child assigned to open and close a door, follow a pony that will not see open sky again until its working life is over, and stand inside the kind of disaster that emptied entire streets of a mining town in a single afternoon. We are going to meet a family who lived and worked, as tens of thousands of families did, entirely by the light of a single small flame, 1,000 feet under a country that never had to think about them at all. Before we go further, if this kind of honest history is something you value, if you would rather sit with the real version of the past than the comfortable one the drawing rooms preferred, take a moment to subscribe. It helps keep these evenings going. And if you would like to, leave a word in the comments about which corner of history you would most like to see uncovered. Next, I read every one of them. Because the arrangement that kept that London parlour warm was not an accident of geology alone. It was an economic system built and maintained by mine owners who understood precisely how much profit sat in every ton of coal, and who understood just as precisely how much it would cost them to make the extraction of that coal genuinely safe. Ventilation could be improved, timber supports could be doubled, safety lamps could replace naked flame in every gallery of every pit in the country. Each of those changes had a price attached to it, and in a competitive industry selling a commodity at a fixed market rate, the owners who spent the least on safety were, in the brutal arithmetic of Victorian capitalism, the owners who profited the most. Parliament had intervened once already in 1842, after evidence so disturbing it shocked even a public well accustomed to industrial hardship. But laws written in London reached the coalfields unevenly, and in 1870, in pits scattered from Northumberland to South Wales, the gap between what the law required and what actually happened underground remained wide enough to swallow thousands of lives a year. Let us begin then, not with the parlour, and not yet with the pit itself, with a family who is about to walk into it on an ordinary morning, in an ordinary week, doing the thing their entire community understood as simply what a person from a colliery row did with their life. His name was Robert Ashworth, and in the autumn of 1870, he was 38 years old, a hewer by trade, which meant he was one of the men whose job it was to cut the coal itself from the seam with a pick, on his knees. One the South Yorkshire coalfield, a few miles outside Barnsley. He had gone underground for the first time at the age of 8, as his own father had before him, and by 38, his body carried a record of 30 years spent bent double in tunnels built for the convenience of the coal seam. His shoulders had rounded permanently forward. A knot of hardened scar tissue sat on each knee from 3 decades of crawling across stone. His hearing in one ear had dulled from years of blasting powder used to loosen the hardest seams, and his cough, a dry, persistent rattle that cleared black each morning before he had eaten anything at all, was so ordinary among men of his trade that neither he nor anyone in his household thought of it as an illness. It was simply what a hewer's chest sounded like, the same way a fisherman's hands were simply rough. His wife, Hannah, was 34 and managed a household of 4 on wages that fluctuated with the price of coal and the whims of the colliery's overman, stretching what money came in across rent, food, coal for their own grate, and the boots that seemed to wear through faster than any family could reasonably afford to replace them. She had worked underground herself as a girl, hauling coal tubs in the years before the law changed in 1842, and she carried, without ever speaking of it directly, a specific and unshakable dread about the day her own children would be old enough to follow her down. That day had already arrived twice. Their eldest, Mary, was 13 and had been working at Redmoor as a hurrier for 3 years, hauling loaded coal tubs called corves through tunnels too low for a grown man to stand upright in, harnessed to the tub by a leather belt and chain around her waist. Their second child, Tom, was 9 and had gone underground for the first time just that spring, employed as a trapper, the job given to the youngest children in the pit, sitting alone in total darkness for the length of a shift to open and shut a wooden ventilation door. The youngest, a boy of 4 named Sam, was still too small for pit work of any kind, and spent his days in the care of a neighbor, while Hannah took in washing, to add what few extra pence she could to the household's slender total. What a stranger passing the Ashworth's cottage on a Sunday might have seen was a family managing, in the specific, disciplined way that colliery families across the county were managing all around them. Robert kept his one good coat brushed for chapel. Hannah kept the front steps scrubbed pale against the coal dust that settled everywhere in a pit village, on window sills, on washing lines, in the creases of every hand. What that stranger would not have seen was Mary's spine, already beginning at 13, to carry a faint, permanent curve from 3 years of pulling loaded tubs bent at the waist, or the raw, calloused band across Tom's small chest where the trapper's door chain sometimes caught him if he dozed against his post near the end of a long, black, silent shift. Robert had a private habit, one Hannah had noticed but never mentioned, of standing a moment longer than necessary at the cottage door each morning before he left for the pit, looking back at the 4 of them as though counting, and then turning without a word toward the colliery yard. He was, in the plain and specific way that mattered most, an ordinary working man doing what every other man in his row of cottages was doing, sending himself, and, increasingly, his own children into a workplace that killed people with a regularity nobody in authority had yet found the will to prevent. On the particular morning this story follows, Robert, Mary, and Tom rose together in the dark, well over an hour before the autumn sun would clear the hills above the colliery, and walked the short distance from their cottage row to the pit yard, where a knot of other men, women no longer among them by law, and children were already gathering under the black iron shape of the winding wheel that would lower them, in a matter of seconds, into a darkness few people who had never done it could properly imagine. We will follow them down into it. But first, the descent itself, and everything the shaft was built to do to a person before the working day had even properly begun. If you picture the descent into a Victorian coal mine at all, you likely picture something resembling a lift, an enclosed box, walls on every side, perhaps an attendant to operate it, carrying its passengers down at a measured, controllable pace. It is an easy image to reach for, because it is the image later centuries built for vertical travel, and it is almost nothing like what actually happened at the mouth of a working pit in 1870. The reality was an open iron cage, sometimes no more than a floored platform with a low rail, or a few crossed bars of iron around its edge, hanging from a wire rope wound around a massive drum at the surface, itself turned by a steam-winding engine housed in a brick tower beside the shaft. A dozen men, women, earlier decades, and children could be crowded onto a single cage for the descent, standing pressed shoulder to shoulder, holding whatever iron they could grip, with nothing beneath their feet but the cage floor, and nothing around them but open air, and the black circle of the shaft itself falling away into darkness. The winding engine man at the surface, watching a dial connected to the drum, controlled the speed of descent, and a good one brought the cage down smoothly. A distracted one or a mechanical failure in the brake could send it plunging far faster than any human body was meant to fall. And the mining records of the period are thick with exactly this kind of accident: cages that overwound, chains that snapped, men crushed against the shaft walls by a cage moving too fast to control. The descent itself, done properly, still took the stomach somewhere it did not expect to go. Pit shafts in the South Yorkshire coalfield by 1870 commonly ran anywhere from 400 to well over 1,000 feet deep, and a cage descending at speed could cover that distance in under a minute, a drop that pressed upward against the chest and stomach the way a fast lift does today. Except with nothing but open bars between the rider and the shaft wall rushing past inches away. Nothing at all below except a shrinking, receding circle of daylight above and an absolute, featureless black below. The temperature changed as the cage fell. The light changed faster still, the grey of a Yorkshire dawn narrowing to a coin of brightness overhead, and then vanishing altogether, so that within the first 20 or 30 seconds of a normal descent, a rider was travelling in total darkness, guided only by the sound of the rope paying out overhead. Mineral. Smell of the air rising to meet them from below. At the bottom, the cage did not so much arrive as simply stop with a jolt that every experienced pitman learned to brace for, and every new one learned the hard way, stepping out onto the floor of the pit bottom into air that had already begun to feel different from the world above in every particular that mattered. It was warmer, sometimes considerably warmer, a function of the Earth's own heat increasing with depth that miners called simply the heat of the pit. And by the deeper workings of a colliery, like Redmoor, temperatures at the working face could climb past 90 degrees Fahrenheit, even in the depths of an English winter. It was heavier, thick with the particular smell of wet stone, coal dust, and the sulphurous tang of blasting powder residue that never fully cleared. And it was dark in a way that surface darkness, even a moonless night above ground, simply is not, an absolute absence of light that the human eye evolved across millions of years to expect at least some ambient glow from stars or sky. To that darkness came the only light most miners had, a Davy safety lamp or one of its later refinements, burning a small, deliberately weak flame enclosed behind a wired gauze mesh designed specifically to prevent it from igniting the gas that might be present in the surrounding air. The gauze worked by dispersing heat fast enough that a flame inside it could not pass through to ignite gas outside it, an elegant piece of applied chemistry that the physicist Sir Humphrey Davy had worked out in 1815, after a series of underground explosions killed enough men in a single decade to make the problem impossible for Parliament to ignore any longer. It also meant that the light available to work by, sing by, and see one's own hands by, 1,000 feet under an English hillside, was reduced to a small, guttering, amber glow, barely brighter than a struck match held at arm's length, glowing behind its wire cage like a captured, half-strangled ember. Miners developed, out of pure necessity, a kind of night vision that surface dwellers never needed, learning to navigate whole galleries of tunnel by touch, by memory, and by the faintest suggestion of light reflecting off wet stone, because the lamp in their hand was never, by design, going to show them very much. For Robert Ashworth, the descent on this particular morning was so familiar after 30 years that his body performed it almost without conscious thought, feet planted, shoulder set against the cage's iron upright, breath held for the first drop the way it always was, even after 3 decades of doing exactly this. For Mary, 3 years into her own working life at Redmoor, the ride down had long since stopped being frightening in any active sense, though she still, without quite admitting it to herself, kept one hand tucked into the crook of her father's arm for the length of the descent, a habit begun at 10 years old that neither of them had ever discussed and neither of them had stopped. For Tom, 6 months into his own employment as a trapper, the cage still took his stomach somewhere. It did not want to go every single time. A small, private terror. He had learned to keep entirely off his face, because Redmore's other boys had made it clear in the particular blunt currency of pit yard reputation. Exactly what happened to a lad who let his fear show. He gripped the iron bar in front of him with both hands, watched the grey coin of morning sky above them narrow and vanish, and felt the familiar drop in his stomach as the cage picked up speed, counting, as he always did, the seconds until the jolt of arrival told him the ride was over, the shift had properly begun. The introduction of engine-driven cages running on guided rails within the shaft, replacing the older and considerably more dangerous system of simple baskets or kibbles hauled up and down on a single unguided rope, had been one of the genuine safety improvements of the mid-19th century, and mining engineers of the period were often proud of it. With reason. But pride in the improvement did nothing to change the raw mechanics of what the improvement still required. Moving human bodies at speed through several hundred feet of open shaft on a wire rope, subject to the same fatigue, corrosion. The official mine inspector's reports for the period, tabulated year after year by the Home Office once the Office of Inspector of Mines was properly established. Record shaft accidents, overwinding, broken chains, falling debris, as a steady, grinding category of death entirely separate from the explosions and roof falls that tended to make the newspapers. Category so routine within the industry itself that it rarely earned more than a paragraph in the local press. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that a miner's working day, every single working day of a career that might last 30 or 40 years, began with an act of genuine physical risk before a single piece of coal had been touched. A controlled fall into the earth on an open iron platform that an untrained visitor would have found simply terrifying, and that the men, women, and children doing it had learned out of sheer daily repetition to treat as no more remarkable than climbing a flight of stairs. Now, labour waiting at the bottom of that shaft, because it was at the coal face itself, in the heat and the crouched, airless dark, that the true cost of Redmore's daily output was paid, hour by hour, by the men whose job it was to actually cut the coal from the earth. If you imagine a coal miner at work, you probably picture something close to standing labour. A man swinging a pick against a wall of coal, the way a woodsman swings an axe against a tree. Upright, with room to move his arms freely and set his feet. The image belongs more to 20th century mining, with its taller tunnels and mechanical cutters, than to the pits of 1870, where the shape of the work was dictated entirely by the shape of the coal seam itself, and the coal seam very rarely cared what was comfortable for the man cutting it. At Redmore, as at most South Yorkshire collieries of the period, the workable seam ran in places under 3 feet high, which meant a hewer like Robert Ashworth spent the greater part of his shift not standing at all, but lying on his side or crouched on his knees in a space that pressed against his back the moment he tried to straighten it. Swinging a short-handled pick in a cramped sideways arc because a full overhead swing was physically impossible in the space available. He worked half undressed, often down to a pair of light trousers or drawers alone, because the temperature at the face, combined with the physical effort of the work itself, made anything more than minimal clothing unbearable, because loose or heavy fabric caught constantly on the low, jagged roof only inches above his back. Sweat ran freely and continuously in that heat, mixing with the fine coal dust that coated every surface, so that a working hewer's skin, by an hour into the shift, had taken on the same uniform, matte black as the coal itself, with pale rings appearing only around the eyes where sweat had repeatedly washed a small, clear patch. A stranger seeing Robert at the face, and Robert at his own front door of an evening, freshly scrubbed, might reasonably have struggled to recognize him as the same man. The tool itself, the pick, was the hewer's primary instrument for the entire shift, though blasting powder was also used at many collieries to loosen harder sections of a seam, packed into a hand-drilled hole, and set off with a fuse, technique that added its own considerable risk of injury from premature explosion, flying rock, and the buildup of smoke and gas the blast itself produced in an already poorly ventilated space. A skilled hewer worked the coal along its natural seams and fractures, undercutting the base of the seam by hand to weaken it before bringing the upper mass down in controlled sections, a technique requiring real judgment and experience, since a poorly undercut face could bring down far more rock and coal than intended. This was skilled, dangerous, physically punishing labor, and it was paid, in most collieries, not by the hour, but by the ton. A piece rate system that meant a hewer's wage depended entirely on how much coal he personally cut. An arrangement that rewarded speed and endurance in exactly the conditions least suited to either. Shifts at Redmoor ran as, at most collieries of the period, somewhere between 12 and 14 hours, and in the deeper, poorly ventilated sections of the pit, that entire span was spent in temperatures that, by the physiological standards later doctors would apply, particularly for men performing sustained hard physical labor rather than simply enduring the warmth at rest. Water was carried down in tin cans and drunk constantly, and still men at the face routinely worked through the kind of dehydration and exhaustion that would, in almost any other setting, have been treated as a medical emergency rather than an ordinary Tuesday. A hewer's day did not end when the coal was cut, either. Once loosened, it had to be loaded into the corves that the hurriers would haul away, and a man's total pay for a 14-hour shift after this exhausting cycle of cutting, loading, and moving to a new working area as the seam was worked out might come to 3 or 4 shillings on a good day. During periods of high coal demand, like the one building through 1870, could support a family reasonably well by the standards of the industrial working class, and that could just as easily collapse into near destitution during a slump in coal prices or a stretch of enforced idleness when the pit itself had more coal ready than the market wanted to buy. For Robert, this particular shift followed the same rhythm that 30 years underground had worn into his body like a groove. He reached his store, the small individual working area assigned to him along the seam, within 20 minutes of leaving the cage, stripped to his trousers, checked his safety lamps flame with the automatic and thinking glance of a man who had done it 10,000 times before, and settled onto his side against the coal face to begin the first undercut of the day. The pick fell in a steady practice rhythm he could sustain, with brief pauses for hours at a stretch, each blow loosening a little more coal, each accumulating pile shoveled back behind him toward the tramroad where Mary and the other hurriers would collect it. His back had long since stopped registering the ache of the position as pain in any conscious sense, the way a lifelong laborer's body learns to file certain discomforts under simply how things are rather than something requiring attention. What he did notice every single shift, without exception, was his own breathing. A faint, persistent tightness in the chest that had been present in some form for at least a decade, that worsened noticeably by the 4th or 5th hour of cutting in unventilated air thick with coal dust, and that he had long since stopped mentioning to Hannah, because there was, as both of them understood, without needing to say it, nothing whatsoever to be done about it. The broader pattern behind Robert's working conditions was neither accident nor mystery to the men who owned collieries like Redmoor. Seam height was a fact of geology no employer could change, but the decision to work seams as thin as 18 inches at all, rather than abandoning them as commercially unviable, was a business calculation weighed against the price coal was fetching and the wages a hewer would accept for cutting it. Ventilation sufficient to keep a working face cool and clear of dust was an engineering problem with known solutions by 1870, larger fans, better designed air circuits, more frequent inspection of airways, and those solutions cost money that came directly out of a colliery's profit margin. The mining engineer and social reformer contemporaries of the period, and later historians of the coalfield, including John Benton, whose research into 19th century British mining wages and conditions remains a standard reference, have traced with some precision how closely a colliery's investment in ventilation and working conditions tracked not the actual danger to its workforce, but the price of coal on the open market, rising when profits were flush and lapsing again the moment they were not. The heat, the crouched posture, the blackened skin, the tightening chest, none of it was hidden from anyone at Redmoor. It was the visible, daily, unremarkable texture of the trade. Every hewer's son grew up expecting to inherit, and Robert Ashworth, watching his own son descend the same shaft that spring for the first time, understood with a clarity he rarely allowed himself to examine too closely exactly what kind of inheritance that was. Which brings us to the question that nobody in that London drawing room would have thought to ask, and that every colliery family in the country was quietly living an answer to. What happened to the youngest children sent underground, the ones too small to hew coal, and too small even to haul it? And what was actually required of a body that age to survive a full shift in the dark? If you picture child labor in a Victorian coal mine at all, you likely picture something resembling factory work. Child standing at a machine, performing a repetitive task under at least some degree of supervision and some flicker of ambient light and human company. The reality of the job given to the youngest children in a pit like Redmoor was almost the exact opposite of that image in every particular, and it is worth understanding precisely because it was, by the account of the children who did it, one of the loneliest and most frightening jobs in the entire colliery. The job was called trapping, and it involved sitting for the length of an entire shift, 12 hours or more, beside a wooden ventilation door built into the tunnel wall. A door whose purpose was to control the flow of air through the mine's underground passages, directing fresh air toward the working faces and away from worked-out sections where it was no longer needed. Every time a coal tub needed to pass through that section of tunnel, the trapper opened the door, held it until the tub and its hurrier had passed, and closed it again immediately afterward, because a door left open even briefly could disrupt the entire ventilation circuit of the pit, starving a working face somewhere else of the air it needed, or, pristine, a worse case, allowing accumulated gas to drift toward an open flame. Between tubs, which might pass at intervals of anywhere from a few minutes to the better part of an hour, depending on the section of the mine, the trapper simply sat alone in the dark. Because a lit candle or lamp was often considered an unnecessary expense for a child whose only task was to listen for an approaching tub and pull a rope or push a door at the appropriate moment. Many trappers worked their entire shift with no light at all, relying entirely on hearing, memory, and touch. The children given this job were, by the letter of the law in 1870, meant to be at least 10 years old, following an amendment to the original 1842 statute that had raised the minimum age once already, though a boy who could demonstrate basic reading and writing was in practice sometimes permitted underground younger still, particularly at smaller collieries, far from the handful of mine inspectors covering enormous districts, remained inconsistent enough that boys of 8 or 9 continued to appear on colliery employment books throughout the decade, their ages quietly adjusted by a parish clerk or a desperate parent when a family's income depended on it. Before 1842, there had been no minimum age at all, and children as young as 5 had worked as trappers in mines across the country, a fact that became public knowledge only because of a royal commission established that year under Lord Ashley, later known as the Earl of Shaftesbury, to investigate the conditions of children employed in mines and collieries. The Commission's investigators travelled to coalfields across England, Scotland and Wales and took sworn testimony directly from the children themselves, testimony that was published alongside illustrated reports in a parliamentary document that shocked a reading public already fairly well accustomed to industrial hardship. Among the children interviewed was an 8-year-old trapper named Sarah Gooder, working at the Gorber pit near Barnsley, within a few miles of the fictional colliery this story follows, whose own words survive in the Commission's official record. Asked to describe her work, he told the investigator, in testimony that has been preserved and quoted by Labour historians ever since, that she worked as a trapper and did not find it tiring, but that she had to trap without a light, was frightened, that she went down at 4 o'clock in the morning and came out again at 5 or 5:30 in the evening, and that she never went to sleep during that time. She said that she sometimes sang to herself when she had a light to keep her company, but never in the dark, because she did not dare. That single piece of testimony, along with hundreds of others like it collected across the coalfields that year, became one of the central pieces of evidence behind the Mines and Collieries Act of 1842, which banned all women and girls from underground work. It was, by any measure, a genuine reform, and it changed the composition of Britain's underground workforce meaningfully within a generation. But a law passed in London in 1842 did not enforce itself in a pit village in Yorkshire in 1870, and the inspectorate created to check compliance remained, for decades afterward, a small handful of men responsible for many hundreds of collieries scattered across the country. A ratio that made anything resembling thorough enforcement a practical impossibility. Tom Ashworth's own trapping post on the shift this story follows sat in a side gallery, roughly 400 yards from the pit bottom, at a door controlling airflow toward one of Redmore's older, partially worked out sections. He was given a stub of candle for the first hour of his shift and told, as every trapper at Redmore was told, that it would not be replaced once it burned out. A small economy that meant Tom spent the greater part of every 12-hour shift in complete darkness, listening for the particular rumble and squeak of an approaching corvée against the rail. The waiting itself was the hardest part, worse in its own way than any physical labor, an unbroken stretch of silence and total black that a 9-year-old's mind filled inevitably with exactly the kind of fear Sarah Gooder had described to the commissioners nearly 30 years before him. Tom had learned in his 6 months at the job to manage that fear by counting silently, in sequences of 100, over and over. A private discipline he had invented for himself, never mentioned to his father, because he understood, in the same unspoken way Mary understood about her own aching back, that admitting to fear was not something a Redmore boy did if he wanted to keep being trusted with the job at all. The physical toll of trapping was different from the toll of hewing or hurrying, less a matter of visible injury than of a slower, quieter kind of damage. Hours of enforced stillness and sensory deprivation that mine inspectors and physicians of the period occasionally noted. Aged still further, a change that arrived gradually across subsequent decades of legislation rather than in any single decisive reform. Trapper boys were widely observed by contemporary commentators to be unusually nervous, prone to a kind of chronic, low-grade anxiety that followed them even during their hours above ground, and modern historians examining the surviving testimony have connected this pattern directly to the specific conditions of the job itself: prolonged isolation, total darkness, and the constant low hum of danger inherent to working in a coal mine at all, absorbed by a mind still years away from full development. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that the very youngest children in the entire colliery, the ones least equipped by age or experience to manage genuine fear, were given the job that most required them to sit with it, alone for 12 hours at a stretch. In a darkness so complete that a candle stub burning out partway through the shift left nothing behind it at all. If the trapper's ordeal was stillness and isolation, the hurrier's was the opposite condition entirely. And Mary Ashworth's body carried the evidence of it in a way that no amount of scrubbing on a Sunday evening could fully conceal. Hurrying was the job of moving loaded coal tubs, called corvees in the Yorkshire coalfield, from the working face where hewers like Robert cut the coal to the main haulage road, where the tubs could be connected to a larger train and drawn to the pit bottom for the ride up the shaft. In the taller, better developed sections of a colliery, this haulage was increasingly done by pit ponies by 1870, but a great many working faces, particularly in the thinnest seams where a pony could not fit at all, still relied entirely on human muscle to move coal from the point it was cut to the point it could be mechanically hauled onward. That human muscle, before the 1842 Act, had very often belonged to women and girls, and even after the law banned females from underground work entirely, the job of hurrying in the narrowest tunnels remained physically demanding enough and paid little enough that it continued to fall disproportionately to the youngest boys in a colliery's employment. Working in harness in a manner strikingly similar to the system the law had supposedly ended. The method itself, documented extensively in the same 1842 commission testimony that recorded Sarah Gooder's words, involved a leather belt or girdle worn around the hurrier's waist, connected by a short length of chain to the coal tub itself so that the child pulled the loaded corve. On hands and knees in sections of tunnel too low to allow any other posture, dragging a tub that loaded with coal could weigh several hundred pounds across uneven rail and standing water for distances that might run to several hundred yards on a single trip, repeated dozens of times across a single shift. In marginally taller tunnels, hurriers pushed the tub from behind instead, bent double at the waist, with both hands against the tub's rear, a posture only slightly less punishing than the crawling harness method, and over months and years, scarcely less damaging to a growing spine. The physical toll of this labor, sustained through the years of a child's most active physical growth, was documented by physicians and commission investigators of the period, with a consistency that left little room for doubt about its cause. Hurriers were widely observed to suffer stunted overall growth compared to children of the same age employed above ground, a pattern later attributed to the combined effects of sustained physical strain, poor nutrition typical of colliery households, and the crouched, unnatural posture the work demanded for hours at a stretch. Spinal curvature was common enough among long-time hurriers, particularly girls who had begun the work very young, that it became a recognizable and much discussed feature of colliery districts, along with a distinctive bowed gait that mining communities themselves, whatever occupation the person had since moved into. The chain and belt themselves left their own permanent evidence, a collis sometimes raw band of skin at the waist and hips that rarely had time to properly heal between one shift and the next. Mary had begun hurrying at 10, 2 years younger than the age Robert privately wished had been possible for her, though the family's finances at the time had made the earlier start difficult to refuse. 3 years into the work, her spine had developed the faint, permanent curve that Hannah, doing the wash each week, noted with a private, wordless grief she had never once put into words in front of her daughter, because Hannah understood from her own girlhood in a different colliery 2 counties away. That pointing it out would change nothing except how Mary felt about a body she could not alter and still needed to keep using every single working day. On this particular shift, Mary's task was pushing rather than pulling the lower gallery she worked, being marginally taller than a full crawling harness required, and her method, refined over 3 years into an efficient, economical set of movements, involved bracing her shoulder and both hands against the rear of a loaded corvée and driving it forward in short controlled bursts along the rail, resting a beat between each push to keep her breathing manageable in air. She made the same run, roughly 200 yards each way, somewhere near 40 times across a single shift, a distance that totaled across 12 hours came to something close to 8 miles of pushing a load heavier than her own body weight through a tunnel she could not stand upright in. The broader context behind Mary's work is, in its own way, a story about how imperfectly a well-intentioned law can actually reach the people it was written to protect. The 1842 Act's ban on female labor underground was, without question, a genuine and hard-won reform, achieved only after the Commission's testimony made the practice impossible for Parliament to continue ignoring, and it did meaningfully reduce the number of women and girls working underground across the following decades. More closely regulated collieries of the Northeast. But the law banned a category of person, not a category of labor, and the physical work those women and girls had been doing did not disappear along with them. In many pits, that work simply transferred to boys whose own minimum age remained lower and whose labor remained, from a colliery owner's perspective, cheaper than a grown man's. The mining historian Angela V. John, whose research into women's underground labor in Victorian Britain remains one of the fullest accounts of the period, has traced this transfer carefully across multiple coalfields, noting that the 1842 reform, for all its genuine importance, functioned in practice as much as a reshuffling of who performed the most punishing labor in a mine, as an actual reduction in how much punishing labor the industry as a whole still required. Mary herself, unlike her younger brother down in his lonely gallery, worked in constant close proximity to other hurriers, a rough camaraderie of children and young teenagers moving coal together across the same stretch of tunnel, calling brief warnings to one another over the rumble of tub wheels, sharing what little water anyone had thought to carry down that morning. It was, in its way, the one genuine mercy of her particular job company in the dark, even if that company could do nothing whatsoever to lighten the actual physical weight she pushed, shift after shift, through air that pressed against her chest like a hand. The definition of a hard day's work was different for a Redmore family than it was for the gentleman warming himself by his London fire, and everybody in that colliery row, every single family sending a daughter or a son down the same shaft each morning, understood the terms of that difference without ever needing to discuss them aloud. There is a particular sound that every Redmore miner learned to listen for amid the general clatter of the pit, a soft, heavy clop of hooves on wet stone, entirely out of place 1,000 feet under an English hillside, and it belonged to an animal that spent more of its life in that darkness than almost anyone at the colliery, human or otherwise. Pit ponies had been part of British coal mining since the middle of the 18th century, introduced originally to replace the human haulage that had, in the earliest and shallowest workings, been managed largely by hand, and their use expanded considerably through the middle decades of the 19th century as collieries grew deeper and their internal haulage roads grew longer than any child or adult hurrier could reasonably cover on foot for an entire shift. By 1870, a working colliery of any real size kept a stable of ponies underground, small, sturdy breeds selected specifically for their compact size, their calm temperament, and their ability to work in the low, cramped conditions, all in trains of loaded corves along rail track that a full-sized horse could never have fit through at all. The practical arrangement in a great many pits was that a pony descended the shaft once as a young animal and did not return to the surface again for the remainder of its working life, sometimes a span of 10 years or more, living entirely in underground stables cut into the rock near the pit bottom, fed on hay and grain carried down specifically for that purpose, tended by a stable boy whose entire job was the care and daily welfare of the animals in his charge. Not every colliery followed this practice with equal rigor. Some brought their ponies up for a period of rest during the colliery's annual holiday closure, and inspection reports from the period show real variation in how consistently even that limited exposure to daylight was actually granted. But at a great many pits, Redmore among them, the plain calculation of moving a pony up and down a working shaft itself, not without risk or cost, meant that once a pony went underground, it very often stayed there for good. The physical consequences of this arrangement were carefully documented by veterinary observers and colliery officials of the period, and the picture that emerges from surviving records is more precise and more troubling than the folk version of the story that later circulated. Ponies kept permanently underground did not, as popular legends sometimes claimed, go uniformly and completely blind as a simple, inevitable fact of darkness itself. Extended time away from natural light did measurably affect the eyes of underground ponies, producing documented cases of impaired vision and heightened sensitivity. And a pony returned briefly to daylight after a long stretch underground could suffer real distress and disorientation from light exposure. The animals also worked in air no better than the air the miners themselves breathed, coal dust, heat, and the same risk of gas exposure, and they suffered a comparable range of respiratory and physical ailments as a direct result. A stable boy at Redmore, a position usually given to a slightly older trapper who had shown a particular gentleness with animals, was responsible for feeding, grooming, and monitoring perhaps 6 or 8 ponies at a time, and the bond that formed between individual boys and individual animals, remarked upon repeatedly in contemporary accounts, was often described as among the most genuine attachments a young pit worker had access to in an environment otherwise almost entirely organized around labor and survival. Tom had not yet been assigned stable duties at Redmore, being newer to the pit than the boys typically given that responsibility, but he had made the acquaintance, in the incidental way a trapper met anyone passing his post, of a pony named Duke, a sturdy, dark-coated animal who hauled a regular train of calves past Tom's door several times each shift, and who had, over Tom's 6 months on the job, developed the placid habit of pausing a beat longer than strictly necessary at the door each time, as if the animal too found something to appreciate in the brief company. Tom had begun saving a small portion of whatever bread he carried down for his own dinner to offer Duke on these passes, a habit he had not mentioned to his father, and one of the very few moments in an otherwise long and frightening shift. Manic, it was, in its modest way, the same instinct that drew grown miners to speak of their ponies with real affection, an attachment to a creature enduring the identical darkness, heat, and danger that they themselves endured without ever having chosen any part of it. The broader context surrounding the pit pony's working life connects directly to the same economic logic that shaped every other condition this story has already described. Ponies were, from a colliery owner's purely financial perspective, a capital investment requiring purchase, feed, and veterinary care, and in the coldest calculation of Victorian industrial accounting, a documented and uncomfortable one. Ponies were sometimes regarded by pit managers as a more valuable asset to protect from injury than the youngest human harriers they had, in many cases, been introduced specifically to replace, since a pony represented a direct capital cost. This did not mean ponies were treated gently. Mine inspectors' reports and later welfare investigations describe considerable cruelty in some pits alongside considerable care in others. The same uneven pattern of enforcement that shaped every safety regulation in this industry. What it meant, more precisely, was that the underground world of a Victorian colliery had produced its own complete, self-contained ecosystem of labor, human and animal together, all of it hidden from a public that bought its coal by the hundredweight without ever picturing the stable boy, the pony, or the 6-year routine of total darkness both of them shared. By the time this story is set, The number of ponies working underground in British collieries had already climbed into the tens of thousands, a figure that would continue rising for decades still to come, alongside the number of children and adults working beside them. Two different kinds of creature, bred and raised in the daylight above. Sent down together into a darkness neither species had evolved to live inside, and asked to spend the greater part of their lives there regardless. Which brings us to the danger that shaped nearly every other decision made underground, from the design of the safety lamp to the placement of the ventilation doors. Tom spent his shift minding a danger that could not be seen, smelled, or heard till the single instant it announced itself with catastrophic force. Fire damp was the miner's term for methane gas, a natural byproduct of the same geological processes that had formed the coal seam itself over millions of years, and it seeped continuously from freshly exposed coal and surrounding rock into the air of a working mine, gathering invisibly in pockets near the roof of a tunnel. Old worked-out galleries with poor air circulation, and in any low unventilated space where it had room to accumulate undisturbed. On its own, in low concentrations, fire damp was not lethal to breathe. What made it the single most feared hazard in the entire industry was its extreme flammability, a concentration of roughly 5 to 15% methane in air forming a mixture that would ignite from any open flame, any spark struck from a pick against stone, any careless moment with an unprotected candle, and burn with explosive, propagating force through an entire section of tunnel in seconds, an explosion capable of racing along the mine's connected airways for hundreds of yards, igniting coal dust suspended in the air as it traveled and multiplying its own force as it went. The Davy safety lamp, already described in this story's account of the descent, existed specifically to manage this risk. Its wire gauze designed to let light out while preventing flame from reaching gas outside the lamp itself. And by 1870 various refined versions, the Clanny lamp and the Muesler lamp among them, had improved on Davy's original design considerably. But the safety lamp was never a complete solution, and everyone who worked underground understood its limitations intimately. The light it produced was weak enough that many miners, working piece rate and paid strictly by the ton of coal they cut, found the dim glow genuinely limited their productivity, and it was not uncommon, despite explicit prohibition and real risk to life, for a miner working what he judged to be a safe section of the pit to remove the protective gauze entirely for a brief period, exposing the naked flame outright to see his work more clearly, a shortcut that mining inspectors documented as a contributing factor in explosion. The lamp itself could also fail through simple wear, a damaged gauze, a poorly maintained seal, turning the very device meant to prevent disaster into the spark that caused one. Ventilation was the other half of the safety equation, and it mattered just as much as the lamp itself, because a mine with strong, well-managed airflow carried accumulating fire damp away from the working faces before it ever reached a dangerous concentration, while a poorly ventilated mine allowed it to build steadily. Still pockets where an unlucky spark was most likely to find it. Ventilation in a colliery like Redmoor depended on a combination of natural air pressure differences between the mine's two connected shafts and mechanical assistance. In many pits still provided by an underground furnace, burning continuously at the base of the upcast shaft, its heat drawing a steady current of air through the mine's tunnels, the way a chimney draws air through a house. An ingenious solution that carried its own obvious irony, since an open furnace flame situated near the pathway of accumulating gas was itself under the wrong conditions. By 1870, larger and better capitalized collieries began installing steam-powered mechanical fans instead, a considerably safer and more reliable method, though the expense of replacing an existing furnace system with new fan machinery meant that plenty of pits, Redmoor among them, continued to rely on the older method well into the decade, alongside careful and constant monitoring, checked door by door, of whether every ventilation door in the mine's underground layout, the very doors that boys like Tom sat minding for 12 hours at a stretch. It was, in fact, precisely this system, this dependence on children sitting alone in the dark to preserve the integrity of an entire mine's airflow, that made trapping a genuinely serious safety role, rather than the make-work task it might appear at first glance. And it was the reason Redmore's overmen impressed on every new trapper, Tom included. The seriousness of never once letting a door stand open longer than necessary, regardless of how tired, frightened, or simply bored a 9-year-old might become across a 12-hour shift. Robert Ashworth had experienced, some 4 years before this story's events, the kind of near miss that every long-time hewer at Redmore carried somewhere in memory, a small, localized fire damp ignition in a working area 2 stalls down from his own, caused by a spark from another man's pick, to a flash of blue flame that burned across the ceiling of the gallery for a matter of seconds before exhausting the pocket of gas that had fed it, singeing the hair and eyebrows of the 2 men working nearest it, and sending a wave of scorching, smoke-thick air rolling through the connecting tunnel. Close enough that he had smelled the burn and heard the men's shouting before the air cleared. Nobody had died that particular afternoon. The 2 injured men returned to work within a fortnight. But Robert had carried, in the years since, a specific, wordless vigilance about checking his own lamp's flame that Hannah had noticed, without ever quite naming it, a habit of glancing upward toward the roof of his stall. Telltale blue cap on his lamp's flame that experienced hewers learned to recognize as the first sign of gas building in the air around them. The broader truth behind fire damp, understood by every mining engineer of the period, even when it went unspoken in a colliery owner's ledger, was that the technology to manage the danger far more thoroughly than most pits actually managed it already existed by 1870. Better fans, more frequent inspection, stricter enforcement of the lamp regulations. One more generous staffing of the underground overmen, whose job included exactly this kind of vigilance. What separated a well-run pit from a dangerous one was very often not knowledge, but expenditure, and the calculation of how much safety a colliery was willing to purchase against how much profit it was willing to sacrifice to buy it, was made in an office above ground by men who would never spend a single shift breathing the air their decision actually governed. If the invisible gas was the danger every miner feared and few ever actually encountered in its worst form, there was a second danger at Redmore that required no ignition, no spark, and no particular bad luck to find a man. It simply waited in the slow, constant creak of wood-bearing weight. It was never quite built to hold indefinitely. For the moment, it finally gave way. Riffles, the sudden collapse of rock and coal from the ceiling of a mine tunnel or working face, killed more British miners across the 19th century than any other single cause, explosions and gas included, a fact that surprised people outside the industry who tended to picture dramatic fireballs when they imagined a mining death. Far more often than they pictured the quieter, more mundane image of a man simply crushed beneath a section of stone that had been groaning its intentions for hours before anyone paid it proper attention. Every tunnel driven through a coal seam removed material that had, until that moment, been physically supporting the rock above it, and every foot of open space created underground had to be held up by something else in its place, a system of timber props and crossbeams set by the miners themselves as they worked, spaced and angled according to experience, local custom, and a certain amount of educated guesswork about how much weight a given section of roof could be trusted to bear before it needed additional support. The timber itself, ordinary pit props cut from young trees and shipped to the colliery in enormous quantities, an entire secondary industry existing solely to keep collieries supplied with wood, was rarely strong enough on its own to hold back the true weight of the rock above a deep working. What it did when properly set was provide warning. A wooden prop under genuine strain did not simply snap without notice. It groaned, cracked, and audibly complained for minutes or sometimes hours before it actually failed. A sound every experienced miner learned to listen for, the way a sailor learns to read the particular creak of a ship's rigging before a storm. The trouble was that a mine like Redmoor produced that same low, constant background of settling wood and shifting stone almost continuously in dozens of working areas at once, and distinguishing the ordinary groan of a tunnel, simply adjusting to newly cut space from the specific escalating groan that meant an actual collapse was imminent, required exactly the kind of experience that took years underground to develop, years that a newer miner, or an exhausted one nearing the end of a 14-hour shift, did not always have the sharpness left to apply. Water compounded the danger considerably, and at Redmoor, as at most collieries sunk into the water-bearing rock strata common across the Yorkshire coalfield, it was a near constant presence rather than an occasional inconvenience. Groundwater seeped continuously through fractures in the surrounding rock, collecting in the lower sections of the mine's tunnels faster than the colliery's pumping engines, themselves steam-driven and prone to the same mechanical failures as every other piece of Victorian machinery could always keep pace with. Miners in the wetter sections of Redmoor routinely worked standing in several inches of filthy, coal-blackened water, sometimes considerably more after a period of heavy rain on the surface far above, their boots in the lower half of their trousers permanently soaked through a shift regardless of the season. That standing water did more than simply make the work unpleasant. It steadily rotted the base of the timber props, holding out the roof around it, weakening exactly the structural elements a collapsing tunnel depended on most, and it softened the rock and coal itself in ways that made unexpected falls measurably more likely in the wettest sections of any given pit. For Robert, the sound of settling timber was so deeply familiar after 30 years that he barely registered it as a separate category of attention anymore. A background hum his ears filtered automatically the way a long-time city dweller stops consciously hearing traffic. What he had never stopped doing in 3 decades at the face was the specific, deliberate ritual of testing a new prop with the flat of his hand before trusting his body under it. A habit his own father had taught him at 8 years old, and that he was already, quietly and without much ceremony, teaching Tom on the rare occasions their shifts overlapped in the same section of the pit. On this particular shift, working a stall close to one of Redmoor's wetter galleries, Robert noticed, midway through the afternoon, a prop some 15 feet from his own position, beginning to crack in a rhythm that struck him as faster and more insistent than the usual settling groan, and he called out, in the flat, economical shorthand miners used for exactly this situation, a warning to the 2 men working nearest it. They cleared the immediate area within a minute, and the section came down perhaps 20 minutes later. A modest fall by the standards of the worst disasters this industry produced, burying a stretch of empty tunnel and damaging some equipment, but claiming no one because 3 men had trusted their ears over their impatience to keep working. Not every fall gave that kind of warning, and not every miner had 30 years of experience to read the ones that did. The official statistics compiled by mine inspectors across the second half of the 19th century record roof and side falls as the largest single category mining death in Britain. Year after year, a steady, unglamorous, that rarely generated the kind of public attention a major explosion did, precisely because it happened in smaller numbers spread across the calendar, rather than in the single catastrophic events that made front pages. The historian Robert Coles, whose study of the northern coalfields working communities remains an important account of pit life in this period, has noted how thoroughly this steady, distributed toll became simply background to colliery families, absorbed into the rhythm of daily life in a way that the rarer, precisely because everybody in a mining village had, at some point, known someone lost to a fall of stone rather than to any single dramatic event. The broader context here returns, as it does throughout this story, to a familiar and uncomfortable arithmetic. Better timbering, more frequent inspection of props, more generous spacing between working faces and the stone above them. All of it reduced the risk of a fall considerably, and all of it cost money and slowed the pace of coal extraction. Since a more cautiously timbered mine produced coal more slowly than a mine willing to accept somewhat greater risk in exchange for somewhat greater speed, colliery owners varied considerably in how they weighed that trade-off, and the surviving inspection records show real differences between the more conscientious operations and the more reckless ones. But even the most conscientious colliery in the country could not eliminate the fundamental physics of removing rock from beneath other rock. And every miner who went underground in 1870, at Redmoor or anywhere else in the British coalfield, understood, without needing the fact stated aloud, that the ceiling above his head was being held up largely by timber, water, and the accumulated hard-won judgment of the men working under it. Every family working at Redmoor in 1870 carried, somewhere close to the surface of memory, the name of a disaster that had nothing directly to do with their own colliery and everything to do with the world they lived inside. And for the Ashworths, that name was Oaks. The Oaks colliery stood only a few miles from Redmoor, in the same South Yorkshire coalfield, and on the 12th of December 1866, a fire-damp explosion tore through its underground workings shortly after 1 in the afternoon, killing the overwhelming majority of the several hundred men and boys working below at the time. The blast was powerful enough to send debris, cages, and a column of black smoke shooting visibly up the shaft, a sight witnessed by the families already gathering at the pit head within minutes, drawn by the ground itself, shuddering under the nearby streets. What followed, across the next day and a half, became one of the defining horrors of 19th century British industry. Rescue parties descended into the damaged workings to search for survivors and recover the dead, understanding the real risk they were taking on, but going down regardless. And on the afternoon of the 13th, a second explosion tore through the mine, killing them along with the mining engineer leading the effort, a well-regarded professional named Parkin Jeffcock, whose death alongside the rescuers under his direction was widely reported and widely mourned across the entire coalfield. A further, smaller explosion followed after that. In the end, more than 360 men and boys died at Oaks across those 2 days, the worst single mining disaster in English history to that point, and the recovery of bodies from the ruined workings continued for weeks afterward, some of the dead, never fully identified, buried instead in mass graves in the local churchyard beneath simple collective memorials. The scale of loss at Oaks was not an abstraction to the communities surrounding it. Entire streets in the neighboring village lost most of their working-age men in a single afternoon. Wives became widows in numbers too large for any single church or chapel to properly minister to, and children across a dozen surrounding parishes grew up without fathers, uncles, and older brothers who had gone down an ordinary shift on an ordinary Wednesday and never come back up. Robert Ashworth's own older brother Samuel had been working at Oaks that December, 26 years old, and newly married the previous spring, and he was among the men killed in the initial explosion, a loss the Ashworth family absorbed in the same silent way that every mining family in the district absorbed a death that touched almost everyone they knew in some fashion. Robert had been 34 at the time, already 10 years into his own career as a hewer, and the news had reached him at Redmore's own pithead within hours, carried by a rider sent specifically to notify collieries across the district. Because a disaster of that size touched every family in the coalfield, whether their own relatives had been underground at Oaks that day or not. Hannah still kept folded carefully at the bottom of a drawer a small printed memorial card from the mass funeral service held for the Oaks dead. A keepsake common enough in mining households of the period that entire local industries had grown up around producing them. And she had shown it to Mary once, several years earlier. Not to frighten her, but because she believed, in the same quiet, deliberate way she managed most difficult things, that a child old enough to work in a coal mine was old enough to understand exactly what that work could cost. Tom did not remember Samuel having been born the year after the disaster, but he had grown up hearing his uncle's name spoken in the specific, careful tone colliery families used for their own dead, and he understood, without ever being explicitly told, that the tone itself was a kind of warning. The disaster at Oaks was not, in the broader history of British coal mining, an isolated horror. It joined a grim list of similarly catastrophic explosions across the century, among them the Hartley Colliery disaster of January 1862 in Northumberland, where the enormous cast-iron beam of the pit's pumping engine snapped and fell directly down the mine's single shaft, completely blocking the only way in or out, and trapping 204 men and boys below, all of whom died over the following days. Not from the initial accident itself, but from the build-up of bad air in a mine with no second means of escape once the shaft was sealed. The horror of men and boys known to have survived the initial accident, slowly suffocating over days while rescuers worked desperately from the surface to clear a block shaft they could not reach in time, produced a public reaction intense enough to force an immediate legislative response. And Parliament passed the Mines Regulation Act of 1862 within months, requiring for the first time that every colliery in the country maintain at least 2 separate shafts, so that a single blockage or collapse could never again seal every miner below. It was this law, more than any other single piece of legislation, that had given Redmore the 2 connected shafts, its own ventilation system, depended on the same shafts. This story has already described Robert, Mary, and Tom descending each morning. The pattern connecting Hartley and Oaks, 4 years apart, and separated by more than 100 miles, was not coincidence. Both disasters occurred at collieries that had, by the standards of contemporary engineering knowledge, cut corners that a better funded, more cautiously managed operation might not have. And both prompted genuine legislative reform only after the death toll became too large and too publicly visible for Parliament to treat as simply the ordinary cost of doing business. Each new law narrowed the gap between what mining safety could theoretically achieve and what a given colliery actually practiced, and each law arrived only in the wake of a specific named catastrophe large enough to overcome the industry's considerable resistance to regulation it considered, from a purely commercial standpoint, an unwelcome drag. For a family like the Ashworths, the practical meaning of Oaks was neither statistical nor legislative. It was the specific, permanent absence of an uncle Tom would never meet, a folded memorial card at the bottom of a drawer, and a particular quality of quiet that settled over Robert's face on the 12th of December each year when he marked, without ever saying so aloud, the date his brother had gone down an ordinary shift at an ordinary colliery and not come back up. Every family at Redmore carried some version of that same private ledger, a name, a date, a colliery somewhere in the district that had taken someone they knew, and it was against the constant quiet backdrop of that shared inheritance that they descended their own shaft each morning, understanding with total done remarkable clarity exactly what kind of industry they had been born into. Explosions and roof falls killed suddenly in a single afternoon, and the coalfield mourned them accordingly with funerals, memorial cards, and newspaper columns that reached readers far beyond the district itself. The danger that killed the largest number of miners over the full span of the century did neither of those things. It worked slowly, quietly, inside the chest of nearly every man who spent a working lifetime at the coalface. And it rarely made the newspapers at all, because there was no single afternoon to report. Every hewer cutting coal at close range, hour after hour, in a poorly ventilated space, breathed in a continuous fine mist of coal dust that settled deep into the lungs, and unlike the larger particles the body's own defenses could clear through coughing, never fully left again. Over years and decades, that accumulated dust caused a progressive scarring, hardening of lung tissue that Victorian physicians observed clearly enough, describing colliers with advanced cases as suffering from what doctors of the period sometimes called black spit or miner's asthma. Worsening breathlessness, accompanied by a persistent black-tinged cough that nearly every long-time hewer eventually developed in some degree. The disease would not receive its modern name, pneumoconiosis, until well into the following century, and the mechanism by which fine coal particles damaged lung tissue was not yet properly understood in 1870, but the pattern itself was entirely familiar to anyone who had spent time in a mining community. By the time he reached his 40s or 50s, had become as reliable a marker of a lifetime spent underground as the coal dust permanently ground into the creases of his hands. Robert's own cough, present in some form since his late 20s and worsening steadily through his 30s, was, by 1870, a fixture of the household routine, so familiar that Hannah could have described its particular rhythm. Easing somewhat during the colliery's rare periods of enforced idleness without needing to think about it at all. He was not unusual. Nearly every hewer his age at Redmore carried some version of the same chronic condition, and the men further along in their careers, those in their 50s who had somehow avoided the more sudden dangers of explosion, roof fall, or shaft accident long enough to reach that age, very often could not climb the short hill from the pit yard to the colliery row without stopping twice to catch a breath that no longer fully satisfied them. Retirement, in any meaningful modern sense, barely existed for a hewer. A man's underground career ended not on a chosen date, but on the day his lungs, his back, or his eyesight finally made the work physically impossible, at which point he moved, if the colliery permitted it, to lighter surface work at reduced wages, or simply stopped working altogether and depended on whatever his family and his community could provide. Water compounded this slow physical toll in ways that went beyond the roof falls already described. Miners working in the wetter sections of a colliery like Redmore spent hours of every shift with their feet and lower legs soaked through, in temperatures that, however hot the air itself might be at the working face, still produced the kind of prolonged dampness that Victorian physicians associated with chronic rheumatism and joint disease. Conditions that appear with striking regularity in the surviving medical and parish relief records for mining districts. Men in their 40s, already stiffened and slowed by joint pain that a modern doctor would recognize immediately as the predictable consequence of decades spent working, quite literally, wet to the knee. Mary and Tom, still young, showed none of these chronic conditions yet in any visible form, though Hannah watched Tom's breathing after each shift with the same private vigilance she had once applied to Robert without either of them discussing it directly. And she understood, from a lifetime spent in a colliery community, precisely what the years ahead were likely to hold for a boy who had begun underground work as young as her son had. The historian John Benson's research into the health and mortality records of 19th century British coalfields documents this pattern with considerable precision, tracing average life expectancy and rates of chronic respiratory and joint disease among miners against the general working population of the period. And the gap that emerges from that research is not subtle. A career at the coalface, however well a man managed to avoid the sudden dramatic dangers this story has already described, extracted its price regardless, delivered, not in a single afternoon, but across a lifetime. One shift, one breath, one wet hour at a time. There is something worth sitting with, the fact that the danger requiring the least drama to kill a miner, no explosion, no collapse, no single terrible moment anyone could point to afterward, was also the danger that killed the largest number of them, simply by being present in every single shift a man ever worked. Absorbed so gradually and so universally across an entire industry that neither the men suffering it nor the society, depending on their labor, ever quite treated it as the crisis its scale actually represented. There is a question that sits underneath everything this story has described so far, one that the gentleman in the London drawing room would never have thought to ask, and that every family in a colliery row understood in their bones without ever needing it phrased aloud. If the work was this dangerous, this punishing, and this certain to shorten a person's life in one fashion or another, what, precisely, did it buy them? The honest answer is more complicated than either a simple story of exploitation or a simple story of prosperity would suggest. And it is worth sitting with that complication rather than smoothing it away. A skilled hewer at a productive colliery like Redmoor, working through the early 1872, a period when coal prices were rising sharply on the back of surging industrial demand and a war on the European continent that had disrupted continental coal supplies, could in fact earn wages that compared favorably to a great many other forms of Victorian working-class labor enough, in a good week, to keep his family fed, modestly clothed, and current on the rent, with perhaps a little left over for the small comforts, a joint of meat on a Sunday, a new pair of boots before the old ones fully gave out. That marked the difference between bare survival and something a family could recognize as a life rather than merely an endurance. This was not nothing, and it is not honest to the historical record to pretend that every mining family lived in the same grinding destitution as the workhouse inmates and casual laborers occupying the very bottom of Victorian society. Coal mining, for a strong, experienced, and reasonably lucky hewer, could be a trade that supported a household with real, if modest, dignity. The word doing the heavy lifting in that description, though, is lucky, and it is worth being precise about exactly how much of a mining family's fortune depended on luck that no amount of skill or effort could fully control. Wages rose and fell with the market price of coal, a price set not by anything happening at Redmoor itself, but by decisions made in distant boardrooms, by continental wars and international demand, by the fortunes of industries hundreds of miles away that happened to burn a great deal of coal. A downturn in the trade could halve a hewer's income within a season, and periods of enforced idleness when a colliery simply had more coal ready than buyers willing to purchase it, left families with no wages at all and no guarantee of when work would resume. Piece rate pay meant illness or injury cost a man his income immediately and completely, with no employer obligation to provide anything resembling continued support, and a serious injury, a crushed hand, a permanently damaged back, could end a hewer's earning capacity for good, at exactly the moment his family most needed it intact. There was no pension, no insurance beyond what a man's own local miners-friendly society might provide if he had paid into one steadily enough across the years, and no guarantee whatsoever that a colliery would still exist, still be profitable, or still want to employ an aging man whose body had begun to slow. By the time he reached the years when he most needed steady, reliable work, set against this individual, fragile prosperity was a national wealth of a completely different order of magnitude. The contrast is worth stating plainly rather than politely stepping around. The coal that Robert Ashworth cut, that Mary hauled, and that Tom's trapdoor helped keep flowing safely toward the surface, powered the railways binding the British Isles together into a single connected economy, fired the furnaces that made Britain the world's leading producer of iron and steel, drove the mills that turned raw cotton into cloth, sold across every populated continent, and fueled the steamships that carried British manufactured goods and British political and military power to ports across a quarter of the globe. The empire Britain governed in 1870, an empire whose administrators, soldiers, and merchants moved by steam power at every stage of the journey, ran in the most literal and physical sense on coal, and the coal it ran on was cut largely by men working on their sides in 18-inch seams for 3 or 4 shillings a day, hauled by children in leather harnesses, and ventilated by boys sitting alone in the dark for 12 hours at a stretch. The profits generated by that entire vast machine flowed overwhelmingly upward to colliery owners, to shareholders in railway and shipping companies, to the manufacturers whose mills the coal kept running, and to a national treasury that taxed the resulting trade and used a portion of the proceeds to fund the very navy and army that protected Britain's global commercial interests. Almost none of it flowed back down into the ventilation systems, the timber supports, or the wages of the people whose labor had generated it in the first place, beyond the bare minimum the market required to keep them willing to keep doing the work. Robert understood this arithmetic in the specific, unromantic way a man understands the terms of his own life rather than as an abstract point of political economy, though the language of political economy existed too, argued over in newspapers, union halls, and the occasional sympathetic sermon by reformers and by the miners' own emerging trade unions and friendly societies, organizations that would spend the coming decades fighting, with slowly growing success, for better wages, shorter hours, and stronger safety regulation than Parliament alone had proven willing to provide. Redmore itself had no active union presence in 1870, though talk of one had begun circulating quietly among the older hewers, Robert included, in the kind of careful, low-voiced conversation that men who depended entirely on a colliery owner's goodwill for their livelihood learned to keep private until the moment came that speaking openly felt safer. Staying silent, what Robert wanted when he allowed himself to want anything beyond simply getting his family safely through another week, was not remarkable or radical by any standard beyond the one Redmore itself was willing to meet. He wanted air that did not thicken his son's small lungs. By the time the boy was grown, he wanted timber that held. He wanted a wage that did not vanish the moment the coal market in London decided it wanted less coal than usual that quarter. He wanted, in the plainest possible terms, for the enormous humming machine of British industry that his own labor helped power to notice, in some small and lasting way, that the machine was built out of people, and that the people building it were entitled to something more durable than the bare wage required to keep them willing to climb back into the cage each morning. There is a particular moment near the end of every shift at Redmore that none of the men, women in earlier decades, or children working there would have described as dramatic, and that was, in its own quiet way, one of the more remarkable transitions any of them made in an ordinary day. Repeated so many thousands of times across a working life that nobody underground thought to remark on it at all. If you picture the end of a miner's shift, you might picture something like the end of any other working day. A walk to the exit, a change of clothes, perhaps a wash, and then home. The actual sequence at a colliery like Redmore in 1870 involved a return journey nearly as physically demanding as the descent that began it, retracing the long crawl or bent double walk back through low tunnels to the pit bottom, often carrying tools, sometimes helping haul a final tub of coal that needed to reach the shaft before the shift officially ended. All of it performed by bodies already exhausted from 12 or 14 hours of continuous physical labor in heat and darkness that had not once let up since the morning's descent. The cage that had dropped them into the earth that morning now carried them back up. The same open iron platform, the same rising speed that pressed differently against the stomach on the way up than it had on the way down, and the same widening coin of daylight overhead growing from a distant pinprick to a full, blinding circle in the space of less than a minute. That final moment of emergence, stepping off the cage into the pit yard after a full shift underground, was, by the account of miners across the period, one of the few real sensory pleasures the job reliably offered, regardless of how exhausted a man's body. Daylight, even the grey, overcast daylight, common to a South Yorkshire autumn, struck eyes that had spent 12 hours adjusted to almost total darkness, with a force that took a moment to properly absorb, and the air itself, however smoke-laden and industrial the surface world of a colliery town actually was, tasted, by every account, cleaner and cooler than anything available 1,000 feet below. Miners frequently described this moment in the diaries and oral histories later historians managed to collect with something close to reverence, a daily, almost ritual gratitude for the simple fact of open sky that a person who had never spent a shift underground could not fully appreciate, no matter how it was explained to them. For Robert, Mary, and Tom, the walk from the pit yard back to their cottage road took perhaps 15 minutes, past other families making the same journey in the same direction, a quiet, blackened procession of men, women, and children moving through the gathering dusk of a Yorkshire evening. Coal dust ground so thoroughly into skin and clothing that a stranger, glimpsing the whole column from a distance, might have mistaken it for a single uniform mass, rather than dozens of individual families walking home. Conversation on this walk tended to be sparse, the particular comfortable silence of people too tired for anything but the essentials. Though Tom, on the better days, still found enough energy left to ask his father some small question about the shift. 1. A habit Robert indulged even on the days his own chest ached badly enough that answering at length cost him real effort. Home itself offered the second major transition of the day, a wash in whatever water Hannah had managed to heat over the grate before their return, performed in a shallow tin bath set before the fire, the water itself turning black within minutes as 3 separate layers of coal dust, one for each family member who had gone underground that day, dissolved into it in succession. Hannah had long since developed a practiced, efficient system for this nightly ritual. Tom first, since he tired fastest and needed to eat and settle before his eyes closed entirely. Then Mary, then finally Robert, whose own wash took longest given the sheer volume of dust. The evening meal that followed was modest by any standard beyond the one the household itself had learned to expect. Bread, portion of bacon or cheese when the week's wages allowed for it, tea strong enough to counter the day's exhaustion. Eaten at a table where conversation slowly returned as the black grime of the pit visibly receded from each family member in turn, until, by the time the meal ended, the people sitting around that table looked, for the first time since before dawn, recognizably like themselves again, rather than like extensions of the mine they had spent the day inside. This nightly transformation, from blackened, exhausted pit worker, back into recognizable son, daughter, husband, and father, was not merely basic hygiene. It was, for families across the entire coalfield, of the few daily rituals that drew a clear, deliberate line between the identity the mine demanded of a person for 12 hours and the identity that person still held onto for the remaining hours that belonged, at least in theory, to themselves. Contemporary social investigators visiting mining districts in this period frequently remarked on the fierce protective pride colliery households took in exactly this ritual. A scrubbed table, a clean hearth, children washed and settled before too late an hour. Maintained with real discipline, even in households where the wages available made every other comfort a genuine struggle. It was a way of insisting nightly against a system that treated a miner's body largely as an instrument of extraction, that the person underneath the coal dust remained a person still, with a home, a family, and an evening that belonged to something other than the pit. By the time Tom's eyes closed that night, curled on the shed mattress, he still slept alongside his younger brother Sam. On his body carried the particular, specific exhaustion of a 9-year-old who had spent 12 hours largely alone in total darkness. An exhaustion that had nothing to do with physical exertion in any conventional sense, and everything to do with a quieter, harder-to-name toll of sustained fear, held carefully in check for the length of an entire working day. Robert, lying awake a while longer beside Hannah, after the children had settled, listened to his own breath rattle faintly in the dark, the same sound it had made every night for a decade, and allowed himself, in the private hour before sleep finally took him, the small specific comfort of having gotten his family through one more shift intact. A comfort that carried underneath it the unspoken awareness that tomorrow would simply ask the same thing of all three of them again. There is one more figure who moved through the world of a colliery like Redmore in 1870, appearing rarely enough that his visits were remembered individually by name and date, and whose presence tells us as much about the limits of Victorian reform as any single statistic this story has already offered. If you picture a government safety inspector visiting a dangerous Victorian workplace, you probably picture something resembling routine, a regular schedule, a thorough walkthrough of every working area, a genuine capacity to compel real change when real danger was found. The office of HM Inspector of Mines had existed, in one form or another, since an Act of 1851 established it, created specifically in response to mounting public concern over exactly the kind of disasters this story has already described. And by 1870, the inspectorate had real, if limited, legal authority to enter a colliery. Its safety lamps, its timbering, and its employment of children, and to report violations that could, in theory, result in prosecution. In practice, the gap between that authority on paper and its exercise underground was enormous. It was a gap every mining family in the country understood intimately, even if they had never studied the legislation itself. England's collieries in 1870 numbered in the thousands, scattered across coalfields from Northumberland to South Wales, and the total number of inspectors charged with overseeing all of them numbered only in the dozens, each one responsible for an enormous district containing hundreds of individual pits. Do far more than any single man could realistically visit more than once or twice a year, if that often. A colliery like Redmore, of middling size and no particular history of catastrophe, severe enough to draw special attention, might reasonably expect an inspector's visit only a handful of times across an entire decade, announced in advance often enough that an owner with something to hide had ample opportunity. Move the youngest and most obviously underage children to lighter surface work for the day, and present a version of the colliery considerably tidier than its actual daily operation. The inspector who did visit Redmore that autumn, a methodical, soft-spoken man named Mr. Fenwick, who had himself begun his career as a working colliery engineer before joining the inspectorate, spent the better part of a full day examining the pit's ventilation system, its safety lamp inventory, and its timbering in the sections nearest the working faces, noting, in the careful, formal language of his eventual written report, several deficiencies he expected the owner to address. most notably an underused second ventilation fan that had sat idle for repairs longer than regulations technically permitted. He also, following standard procedure, asked to see the colliery's employment book, the official record. Every mine was required to keep listing the name and age of every worker on its payroll, and it was here that the inspection's actual limits became clearest. Tom's age was recorded in Redmore's book as 10, a full year older than his true age, an adjustment made quietly by the colliery's own clerk at the request of an overman who needed trapper posts filled and had learned from long practice precisely which details an inspector's single-day visit was unlikely to verify. Mr. Fenwick had no realistic means, in the course of one day spent examining an entire colliery's ventilation, timbering, and safety equipment, of cross-checking a 9-year-old boy's recorded age against a parish birth register in a different township, and he had, by his own later private admission to a colleague, long since come to suspect that a meaningful fraction of the boys he encountered underground across his district were younger than their employment records claimed, without possessing any practical way to prove it case by case. This was not a failure unique to Mr. Prennan. Fenwick's diligence and the surviving inspectorate reports from the period, examined collectively by later labour historians, show the same pattern repeating across coalfield after coalfield through the middle and later decades of the century. The law itself, hard-won through the testimony the Shaftesbury Commission had gathered in 1842 and refined through subsequent amendments raising minimum ages and tightening requirements across the following decades, represented genuine progress against a system that had, within living memory, permitted 5-year-old children to work as trappers with no restriction whatsoever. But a law's existence and a law's enforcement were separated, in practice, by an inspectorate too small, too infrequent in its visits, and too easily anticipated by owners and overmen with every incentive to present a temporarily improved version of an otherwise unchanged operation. And it was this gap, more than any deficiency in the law's actual wording, that allowed boys like Tom Ashworth to keep descending Redmore shaft years after Parliament had formally decided that children his true age no longer belonged there. Robert understood this dynamic without needing it explained in any formal sense, the same way he understood the market price of coal or the particular sound of a failing timber prop as simply one more fact of the world he and his family occupied. He had watched Mr. Breeder. Fenwick's methodical, well-intentioned inspection from a respectful distance that morning had answered the 2 brief questions the inspector put to him about ventilation in his own working section, and had said nothing whatsoever about his son's recorded age, because saying something would have cost Tom his post and the family a portion of income they could not currently do without, an impossible calculation that Robert resolved as thousands of fathers across the coalfield resolved it in exactly the same circumstances, by staying silent and hoping, in the specific, hard-edged way hope survived in a household like his, that the law would eventually catch up to a reality it had already, on paper, declared unacceptable. Step back now from the individual chapters of this story, from the cage and the coalface, the trapper's door and the hurrier's train, the invisible gas and the groaning timber, and a handful of patterns emerge clearly enough that they are worth naming directly because they connect not just to a single colliery in South Yorkshire, but to the entire vast, largely invisible machine that kept Victorian Britain warm, lit, and running. The first pattern is this. Nearly every danger this story has described was to some meaningful degree a solved problem in 1870, or at least a problem for which real solutions already existed and were already in use somewhere in the industry. Mechanical fans ventilated some collieries far more reliably than the furnace systems still common at pits like Redmore. Improved safety lamps, better timbering practices, more thorough and more frequent inspection, all of it existed, was understood by mining engineers of the period and was being applied unevenly at the better funded and more conscientiously managed operations across the coalfield. What separated a relatively safer colliery from a truly dangerous one was, very rarely, a lack of available knowledge. It was a calculation made by owners answering to shareholders and to their own competitive position in a market selling a commodity at a fixed price, about how much of that available safety was worth purchasing against how much profit they were willing to sacrifice to buy it. Robert Ashworth's chronic cough, the idle second fan Mr. Fenwick noted in his report, the timber left standing a season longer than it should have been, all of it traced back, in the end, to that same quiet arithmetic. The second pattern concerns who actually carried the heaviest share of the risk this arithmetic produced. And the answer, with striking consistency across every chapter of this story, was the people with the least power to refuse it. Children work the loneliest, most frightening post, precisely because their labor was cheapest. And the same law that had banned the very youngest of them from the work in 1842 pushed against an enforcement system too thin and too easily anticipated to make that ban fully real, so that boys like Tom Ashworth kept descending shafts. They were not legally supposed to be anywhere near. Their true ages quietly adjusted in an employment book by adults who needed the work done and understood correctly how unlikely anyone was ever to check. Grown men bore the crushing physical toll of a lifetime spent cutting coal in spaces built for the seam rather than the body developing by their 40s. The same chronic breathlessness that had shortened their own fathers' working lives before them in a trade that offered no pension, no guaranteed continued employment once a man's body, and no institutional memory of the individual lives spent to keep the coal flowing. The third pattern is the gap visible in every chapter of this story between reform as it existed on paper in London and reform as it actually reached a working coalface in South Yorkshire. The Mines Act of 1842, the Mines Regulation Act of 1862 passed in the wake of Hartley, the steady accumulation of subsequent amendments raising minimum ages and tightening safety requirements, each represented a genuine, hard-fought victory, achieved only after evidence disturbing enough to overcome an industry's considerable resistance to being regulated at all. But a law was only ever as real underground as the inspectorate's capacity to enforce it, and that capacity, spread across an entire industry by a workforce of inspectors, numbering in the dozens, remained thin enough throughout this period that the distance between what Parliament had decided and what actually happened 1,000 feet under a Yorkshire hillside stayed wide enough to swallow a great many individual children, Tom among them, whose lives the law had already formally decided to protect. And the fourth pattern, threading beneath every other one, is the almost total invisibility of this entire world to the society it served. The gentleman in his London drawing room warming himself by a fire built from coal he had never once had to think about was not a villain in any deliberate sense. He was simply the beneficiary of a system built with real success to keep its costs entirely out of view so that comfort above ground could be enjoyed without any accompanying obligation to picture what that comfort had required underneath it. This was not unique to coal. It was in miniature the operating principle of an entire industrial empire. Wealth and convenience flowing upward and outward from labor that remained, by design and by simple physical distance, unseen by the people who depended on it most completely. None of this diminishes what Robert, Hannah, Mary, and Tom actually managed to build for themselves inside a system indifferent to whether they survived it. They were resourceful in ways the wage book never credited them for, and quietly enduring hardships, the system that profited from their labor never once had to acknowledge causing. Robert Ashworth's own father had gone underground before him, and Robert's own son was already following the same path. And yet across 3 generations of a single family, something had also, gradually, undeniably improved. A minimum age that had not existed at all before 1842. An inspector who, however limited his reach, at least existed, and at least occasionally found something worth reporting. Change had come slowly, unevenly, and far too late for men like Samuel Ashworth and the hundreds who died alongside him at Oaks. But it had come, driven not by the industry's own conscience, but by the accumulated pressure of testimony, disaster, and the slowly shifting will of a public that could, when the evidence became undeniable enough, occasionally be moved to demand better. Return now to that London drawing room, still glowing in the last hour before midnight, the fire built up high, the gas mantles hissing their steady warm light across velvet the color of claret. The gentleman is still describing his railway line. The mahogany table still holds the fire's reflection like a second, smaller flame. Nothing in the room has changed since this story began. Only the eyes looking at it have. You are looking now at a fire built from coal cut by a man lying on his side in a space barely tall enough to turn over in, his back rounded permanently forward by 30 years of exactly that posture, his breath already carrying the faint, persistent rattle that would, within another decade or two, amber slow him the way it had already slowed every hewer at his colliery old enough to have earned it. You are looking at a fire whose fuel passed on its journey up from the earth, through the hands of a 13-year-old girl, harnessed to a coal tub by a leather belt and chain, pushing a load heavier than her own body some 8 miles across a single shift, her spine already beginning the faint permanent curve that every hurrier in her district carried by adulthood as visibly as a trademark. You are looking at a fire kept burning, in part, by the ordinary daily courage of a 9-year-old boy who spent 12 hours alone in absolute darkness beside a wooden door, a stub of candle burning out somewhere in the first hour of his shift and never replaced, and counting silently to 100 over and over. To keep the particular fear Sarah Gooder had described to a parliamentary commissioner nearly 30 years earlier from closing. You are looking at a fire that exists because a pony named Duke has spent years of his working life in permanent underground darkness, hauling coal trains past a boy who saves him bread from his own meager dinner, the one piece of unguarded affection either of them gets across a long, frightening shift. You are looking at a fire whose fuel traveled up a shaft that exists in its current safer form specifically because 204 men and boys once suffocated behind a single blocked passage at a colliery in Northumberland, and whose absence of a still worse catastrophe on this particular day owes something to a hewer's practiced ear for the particular rhythm of a failing timber prop, tested against the countless times that same rhythm, misjudged or missed entirely, had buried men just like him at a colliery a few miles from his own. You are looking at a fire that this family and hundreds of thousands of families like them scattered across the British coalfields paid for with lungs that would never again draw a full, clean breath, with joints stiffened by decades spent standing wet to the knee in filthy standing water. A name spoken in a particular careful tone at a particular time each December, folded at the bottom of a drawer alongside a printed memorial card from a mass funeral for more than 360 men. None of it was visible from the fireside where the gentleman stood, warming his hands, describing his railway line to companions who nodded along without any particular thought for where the rails themselves, or the coal that had smelted them, had actually come from. None of it made its way into his evening's conversation, or needed to, because the entire elaborate machinery of Victorian industry had been built with real success to keep exactly this distance intact, comfort here, cost there, The two never required to occupy the same room or the same thought at the same time. It was every bit of it, exactly as real as the fire the gentleman was actually looking at, and considerably more true to what that fire actually cost than anything he would ever have occasion to learn. The Ashworths, like the Radleys and the countless other families this kind of story could equally have followed, were composite figures built from the documented patterns preserved in the parliamentary testimony of the 1842 Commission, the wage books and employment registers. Historians like Angela V. John and John Benson have spent decades tracing across the surviving colliery records, and the mine inspector's own reports, imperfect and understaffed as the inspectorate itself remained throughout this period. But the family they represent was never a small or unusual one. By 1870, several 100,000 people across Britain earned their living inside the coal industry in one capacity or another, and while the worst of the child labor practices the 1842 Commission had documented were by this point meaningfully reduced from what they had been a generation earlier, the underlying shape of the work, the heat, the darkness, the invisible gas, the crumbling roof, the crushing weight of a corvée dragged by harness through a tunnel too low to stand in, remained recognizably the same industry that had shocked Lord Shaftesbury's investigators 3 decades before. Every specific detail this story has described, the open cage and the amber lamp, the trapper's candle burning out unreplaced, the hurrier's chain, the pony that never sees open sky, the timber that groans before it breaks, the gas that gives no warning at all, happened not once to one family but many thousands of times over. Across a coalfield stretching from Northumberland to South Wales, to families whose names survive today, if they survive at all, only in the flat administrative columns of a colliery's own wage book. This is why a story like this one deserves to be told slowly, with the same patient attention a historian gives a fragile document or an archaeologist gives a single fragment of pottery brought up carefully from the dark. Not to assign blame across a century and a half of distance that makes blame a fairly hollow exercise by now. Not to congratulate the present for having moved comfortably past it, when industries built on labor, its beneficiaries never have to see or think about, have never entirely vanished from how the world actually works, even now. Simply to see clearly for a few quiet hours what an ordinary family in an ordinary mining town actually carried every single working day, so that a fire could burn steadily in a room several hundred miles away, tended by people who never once had cause to wonder what it had cost. Some years after the shift this story has followed, Redmoor's coal seams still ran thin and difficult in the same places they always had. But change had reached the colliery in the slow, uneven way it reached most of the coalfield across these decades. A second mechanical fan had finally replaced the idle one Mr. Fenwick had noted in his report, installed not from any sudden change of heart on the owner's part, but because a further round of legislation in the following years had made the old furnace system too costly to defend against inspection. Tom, older now and properly of legal age at last, had moved up from trapping into hurrying alongside the boys his own age. The worst of the isolating darkness behind him, though the ache Hannah had once watched for in his breathing had by then begun making its own quiet, familiar appearance, inherited in the way so much in a mining family was inherited. From a father whose own chest had grown steadily worse across the same passing years. Mary, 19 now, had left underground work for a position in service at a house some miles distant, a change her mother had pushed for with a determination Mary only fully understood once her own back, permanently marked by her years as a hurrier, made the decision feel less like ambition. Robert still worked the face most days that his lungs allowed it, slower now, resting more often between undercuts than he once had, teaching Tom the same specific skills his own father had taught him. The sound of a prop under real strain, the faint blue cap on a lamp's flame that meant gas building somewhere close, the whole hard won. unwritten curriculum that kept a Hewis family alive, one shift at a time. On a Sunday some while after, with the week's wages stretched carefully across a table that held, for once, a proper joint of meat, Robert found himself watching his family eat in the specific, unremarkable quiet of people simply glad to be together and fed. Sam, old enough now himself to be asking increasingly pointed questions about when his own turn underground would come, Tom answering him with the careful, slightly weary authority of an older brother who already understood more about the answer than either of them wished he did. Nobody at that table thought to remark on how ordinary the meal was. It was simply Sunday, available to any family whose luck, skill, and sheer stubborn endurance had held long enough for one more week. Hannah, watching all of them, still kept the private habit she had carried since the year Samuel died at Oaks, of counting, without ever quite admitting she was doing it, the people at her table, making certain every single evening that the count came out whole. They were not, any of them, simply the entries of Colliery's wage book reduced them to a name, an age, sometimes a falsified one, a shift, a tonnage cut or hauled. They were a family that walked into a shaft every working day of their lives, that the society depending on their labor never once had to look at closely, and that walked back out of it again most days, carrying both their lives and the accumulating physical cost those lives had quietly absorbed on behalf of a country that kept itself warm, lit, and running without ever asking what the warmth and the light had actually required. They were resourceful in ways the system never credited them for, and quietly enduring a burden the system never fully acknowledged placing on them. They were, in the plainest and most important sense, exactly what every family working a British coalfield in 1870 actually was: ordinary people meeting an extraordinary daily demand for endurance. Change kept coming, slowly, after the year this story has followed, in the same halting, disaster-driven rhythm that had produced every reform so far. Coal Mines Regulation Act of 1872 tightened the rules on ventilation, the qualifications required of an overman on the minimum age for underground work once again, and expanded the inspectorate's reach, if only modestly, against an industry that still numbered its collieries. Miners' unions, barely whispered about in a place like Redmoor in 1870, grew across the following decades into a genuine political force, winning, shift by hard-fought shift, the shorter hours and stronger safety enforcement that Parliament alone had never moved quickly enough to provide on its own initiative. Child labour underground did not end in a single year or a single law. It receded gradually, generation by generation, as compulsory schooling took firmer hold, as wages for grown men slowly improved enough that a family no longer depended quite so absolutely on a 9-year-old's few pence a day, and as the accumulated weight of testimony, from Sarah Gooder's words in 1842 to the reports filed by inspectors like Mr. Fenwick decades later, made the practice increasingly difficult for the public conscience to keep ignoring. None of it arrived in time for Samuel Ashworth, or for the hundreds of men and boys who died alongside him at Oaks, or for the countless trapper children whose names never made it into any surviving record at all. But it arrived, eventually, for the children who came after them, which was, in the plain accounting of a mining family's own hopes, very nearly the entire point of enduring what came before. The pit wheel at Redmoor still turns tonight somewhere in the dark, though the particular seam Robert Ashworth once worked has long since been exhausted and abandoned, filled in and forgotten by everyone except the handful of local historians who still trace its old workings on paper maps. The London drawing room this story opened in has been renovated many times over since, its coal grate replaced eventually by other forms of heat entirely. The family who once warmed themselves in front of it, gone now, unremembered by anyone beyond their own descendants. But the people who once kept that fire burning and every fire like it across a nation that ran, for the better part of a century, almost entirely on coal, were real, in every specific and physical sense that matters. And the story their bodies actually lived through deserves better than the silence most of that century gave it. The lamps are low tonight. The fire in that distant drawing room burned down at last to embers, and the truth of where its warmth came from has been told as plainly as this story knows how to tell it. Not the version the gentleman by the mantel would have recognized, admiring his railway line without a thought for the rail's true cost. The version that actually happened, quietly, one shift at a time, in the dark, in the heat, in the small and constant courage of people whose names were never going to appear in any newspaper, and who went down into the earth again the next morning anyway, because that was simply what their lives required of them, and because somewhere above them, a fire was waiting to be lit. Sleep well.